May that continue. Tom Karma this morning reminded us of the challenges of giving support and services in remote regions, reaching a very big, diverse continent like ours, reaching people in remote communities, those who often are most in need, understanding what their needs are. He spoke of empowering Indigenous peoples to drive their own culturally appropriate services. Faye challenged the patronising, limiting, often tokenistic involvement of mental health consumers and peer-driven programs in the mental health sector. And we're wondering, in a way, in this next discussion, if technology can respond to both of those challenges, meeting people's needs, understanding what they are, and also helping people drive more self-directed programs of support for themselves. As we know, technology can isolate us, it can enable us, it can alienate us when we feel technically inept. What can it offer you as leaders in mental health? What does it have to do with helping people get well and stay well? Can it help you meet the increasing demand for support and care and treatment? Does our own, as leaders, our own individual lack of confidence or competence with technology, stop us from using it as a creative tool to change how your mental health services are built and offered? So this next session features two of Australia's really most innovative, most driven leaders, I want the medication they're on, in driving mental health advocacy and policy and activism. They've had an impact nationally, they've had an impact internationally, and they want to talk tech with you. So we're going to kick off with Jonathan, or Jono Nicholas. Jono is one of Australia's most prominent and passionate advocates for the mental health of young people. He's CEO of ReachOut.com, that's the web address, by the Inspire Foundation. He was part of the original team that set up that website in 1998, 20 years ago. Go figure. How did that go so fast? It, at the time, was the world's first online mental health service, and Jono was pivotal in building it in Ireland as well. And he's really driven by this belief that rethinking our approach to mental health care will allow all young people to access help during tough times. And, well, let's just welcome him on the stage to offer a provocation for you about technology and the way you use it. Thank you. Jono Nicholas.
Thank you, and thank you for coming this afternoon. I'm going to tag team with Ian Hickie, and my job is really to challenge you, to either get you really excited at the world we're living in or completely terrify you as to what we're doing. By way of background, and it was just shared with you, so as I shared, I've been in this space for about 20 years. ReachOut was the first online mental health service in the world when we launched in 1998. And we now operate in 3 countries, Australia, US and Ireland, and certainly having a number of interesting conversations with people from other countries around how can we form partnerships to launch similar services elsewhere in the world. And for those that might be interested in that, I'm certainly happy to have a conversation with you about it. I want to take you back to 2008. I've been doing a whole series of speeches built around film, and I've been using a Star Wars film where this is a new hope. We are now in Empire Strikes Back territory, and hopefully in the next 4 years we'll be at Return of the Jedi. But if you look at this, it's really about saying this was one of the iconic images of the time. It really was a new hope. We had a president who was an outsider. We had someone who built their whole campaign strategy around optimism. And we had someone who literally at the time, one of the big conversations was, will he bring his crackberry to the presidency? Think forward 8 years. The biggest conversation in politics is the colour of the hair of the president and will it fly off his head, right? It's certainly not an optimistic conversation that we're now having. And BlackBerry is dead and potentially resurrected. So we live in transformative times. And so my challenge to you off the back of this is, how much has your life and the mental health system in which you work changed in the last 8 years? So who would say not at all or just a little bit? How much has your job changed or your system changed in the last 8 years? Hands up if you go not a lot or not at all. Who would say somewhat? Who would say it's been transformed? It's an interesting insight, right? If you talk to a technology company, I guarantee they're at the not at all territory, right? And when we talk about transformation, when we talk about speed of transformation, it's really in this context of how much change over what time period and what does different look like. And it is a subjective assessment. I think, you know, for me, when I was listening to Faye's wonderful call to arms, I think there was very much for me of maybe not so much has changed in terms of the experiences of people using our systems. When I go to conferences on suicide prevention, I can largely map out the keynotes, and that they're probably not changing a lot in terms of the populations who are affected by suicide, the trajectory of suicide. And so my kind of question, certainly my challenge is I would be in the not at all to only a little bit camp. But disruption is coming. And so when you look at disruption, disruption is really change that we can't control, where outside forces are really changing what we do. And when you look at this and you look at the evidence, what are the preconditions for disruption? There are really 6. Does the area have big money? Mental health is big. There is a lot of money going into mental health, and there will be more going into it globally. Does it have a large affected population? Well, when you look at it as a health condition at any given time, 1 in 4 people, 1 in 2 people across the lifespan, this is a big area, right? It reaches a lot of people across all socioeconomic groups and across the world. Do you have a dissatisfied community? I don't know anyone who goes, I think we have a world-class mental health system in any country I've ever visited. I don't know too many people who've experienced the mental health system who go, do you know what, that was awesome. I got the best care. Do we have a community-controlled system, what would be the ultimate user, or do we have a provider-controlled system? Most of what we experience in mental health is that the providers control the system. I think that was, for me, my big takeaway from Faye's speech, which is, do we feel in control? Do we get to make the decisions as to what the system looks like, the care I get, the decisions that are made around my life? Is it efficient? Systems that are ripe for disruption are highly, highly inefficient. And finally, does it operate under a protected framework? I think healthcare, probably more than any other framework, operates under a very protected legislative framework. The government largely tells you who you can go and see, when you can go and see, how many times you can go and see them, how much money you get rebated for any particular thing. So when you look at those conditions and think about it in relation to, say, the taxi industry, the taxi industry met each of those conditions and therefore was ripe for disruption. Healthcare is absolutely ripe for this sort of disruption, where rather than change going through the existing structures, it will go around the existing structures. To the conversation I had with Ian Hickie, change is coming and it's already here, we just don't know it yet. And the reason we don't know it is because we're operating still in this protected environment where largely government and the funding environment is controlling the parameters of change. The question is, will that change in the next few years? So when you look at it, the evidence is certainly showing that the cracks are opening. When you look at the investment going into health and healthcare and where that investment's going from, it's actually kind of quite fascinating. Does anyone know of the Headspace Health meditation app? Does anyone know how much private equity it raised in the last 3 months? 50 million. Does anyone know how much Headspace app is now worth? $250 million. Right? It gives you some idea when private equity people are putting in 50 million for a 250 million company, you know change is coming. When you look at Jawbone, Jawbone is roughly, so the self-managed app, roughly about a $350 million company. These are companies that didn't exist 3-4 years ago. These are not pharmaceutical companies with a long history. These are companies that are being created now. So when you look at disruption, you start looking at these sorts of indicators to say, there are new players in town, they are raising money incredibly quickly, and they are going around structures straight to the consumer. They are not worried about going through and getting government money and raising charities and doing all the things that we're used to. They are going around it and drawing new capital. So what then are the challenges that emerge when you operate in this disrupted environment, right? And I will be very clear that this is disruption. Disruption is change that is uncontrolled by the existing players, as opposed to transformation or others where we are a part of this change. The 3 challenges that I see in healthcare Firstly, that you have globalized delivery. In fact, there's some really interesting research done by EY, the consultancy firm, that shows at the moment the total population, global population who expect high quality healthcare in the world is roughly 1.5 billion people. In the next 5 years, that will go to 3 billion people and 5 billion people in the next 10 years. The workforce capacity of the existing system to deliver high quality healthcare can't absorb that growth, and those people won't assume that they will get it from their existing local communities. If you live in India or you live in Indonesia, the speed at which you can grow what we see as a healthcare environment for high quality healthcare won't simply be there. So we're about to move into the globalized healthcare environment, where literally you can have a provider across the other side of the world that doesn't rely on you going through government and a whole range of other things. So one of the existing assumptions of mental health care is people stay where we want them to stay. They don't go around us, they have to go through us, they have to go to our psychologists and our psychiatrists, they have to go through our system, they have to engage with government. This will largely change the environment in which we work in. It won't necessarily be good or bad, I'm not making any judgment about this, simply that it provides challenges and opportunities for how we deliver services and the assumptions that we've built our services upon in terms of limited demand, limited supply. What you see in disrupted environments is profit is the major motive, not social outcome. Most of the changes in highly disrupted environments are actually run by people who fundamentally are libertarian. They believe in small government, they don't really believe in paying taxes, they don't really believe in government a hell of a lot at all. Certainly if you're the Uber CEO, you're not a big fan of some of the structures that we value. But also, if you look at this purely from a profit motive, then in a globalised world, if you're one of those companies, you're looking to pick off what you would view as high-value customers. Those with mild to moderate, easy to solve issues that people can self-manage, that's where the profit is. You're not interested in people with complex difficulties. So what we could see is a massive movement of capital towards profit as the major motive that helps some people incredibly well manage their life, but actually leaves our health systems struggling with an incredibly difficult set of scenarios and economic environment that we can't control. And governments have little influence. One of the great assumptions of our healthcare system is government's important, right? It decides it's one of the major providers. In fact, I've had a number of conversations with bureaucrats over the years saying, we fund you, therefore we own you. You are not an industry partner, you are a recipient of our funds and we get to control you. In this scenario, things change and things change very quickly, where, as you've seen in the taxi scenario, Uber and in the hotel industry with others, government plays catch up. The consumer, the community moves, government tries to catch up, and largely by that stage people have gone. And so one of the challenges for all of us is we have a history in this environment of kind of cooperation, sometimes functional, sometimes dysfunctional, between predominantly a non-profit sector that has a deep interest in the community it serves, consumers who have a deep interest in getting the right care, and government. Private, certainly in mental health, private hasn't, beyond the pharmaceutical industry, hasn't played as big a role. That will certainly change as new players, particularly private equity and other players, enter the game and look to make changes in 2, 3, 5 year periods of time. So as I said, you're talking about companies that didn't exist 3 years ago, now valued at $250 million, $500 million, that will start to attract the sort of capital that make these things really interesting. So what is it that we should do? As I said, part of my challenge here is really to provoke you either to go, that sounds about right, what do we do? Certainly challenge some of these assumptions, but it's really for me to say that unless we engage, unless we get into this debate and steer it in a way that best serves the community outcomes, we will be chasing it at some point. It may not be in the next 1 year, it may not be in the next 3 years, it'll certainly be in the next decade. And so what is it that we could do to change some of the things that mean that we can engage in this transformation? What is it that technology does better than humans and that can actually mean that we can change some of these environments? The first is automation of repetitive processes. When you actually look at how people get help, a lot of it is repetitive processes that have been traditionally done by human beings that don't really need to be done by human beings. When you look at what happens in the banking environment, they really looked at what repetitive processes can be stripped away and how do we then employ people to, in their world, add value. And the banking system is probably the one system that recognised disruption was coming and owned it, to the extent that the players from 10, 15 years ago are largely still in power. right? Whether you like it or not, they manage that disruption environment incredibly well and far better than the music industry or any other industry. Technology means that complex systems are very well organised, right? One of my big frustrations is people say, oh, the mental health system's so complex, we need to simplify it by stripping out choice. It's a ridiculous argument. In a globalised healthcare environment, choice will go up, not down. Your attempt to strip out players, strip out NGOs is a redundant conversation because others will fill it. What technology does is say, I accept that there is complexity and we will organise it better, to the extent where when I go to the US, there is a hotel room waiting for me in 3 months' time that I've booked now. You don't kind of say, actually, it's really hard to find a room in an overseas country, therefore I can't do it. If only we had one hotel chain, the world would be a very easy place. So the answer here is not to lessen choice, but to make it very well organised and make it very responsive. Think about things like open marketplaces where people have got rating individual buyers and sellers. That gives you an idea of how well technology can make a lot of choice very easy for people to understand and also create very, very good feedback loops so that people can use those feedback loops to make choice about things and people that they otherwise don't know, have a lot of information about, and largely feel very satisfied with the outcome. I don't know too many people who go, I got ripped off on eBay. They're largely satisfied and largely met their expectations as to what they got. And the third thing that technology does very well is it distributes self-management, right? It actually puts the tools back in the hands of the person and gives them the ability to make very complex decisions very easy. And what it then does is say, we will add value, humans will add value over and above that. So either the interaction with people becomes a choice, you could automate it but you prefer not to, or the human engagement is complex enough that people find value in those things. But what we see, if you talk to a teenager now and say, would you like to spend Friday afternoon in a queue at a bank to do the banking? They go, why? Why would I not check my bank balance at 3 o'clock in the morning? What kind of crazy person are you to do this, right? So what we see is that these changes come through very, very quickly and people like self-management and then they choose to add value over and above that. If people think these changes take a long time to go through, 3 years ago, I would have said to my kids, don't get in a car with a stranger. Now I say, not only get in a car with a stranger, pay them and do it through your mobile phone. Right? So communities adjust very, very quickly to these changes. If those changes make sense, if they are reputable, if they're safe, and if people have a sense of control. And if you look at what Uber did, it basically took a very confusing, badly run system and made it very easy for an individual to control and therefore opened up the number of providers and made those providers equitable where people are choosing between a car of a stranger they didn't know that they otherwise would have found very scary to a taxi that they otherwise 3 years ago would have found very, very safe, right? And you see these changes quite quickly. I don't see any reason why this wouldn't occur in healthcare. It's just simply that we haven't been exposed to these particular forces. So that's really where we're at. We can start utilising some of these changes. As existing people in the system, we have incredible advantages to do so. And so this then is finally just what would be my 3 things that I think this leadership group could do. What are my 3 practical ideas? The first thing is set up reciprocal funds in each of our kind of countries to shift IP and innovation between countries. One of the great challenges of being an organisation and a non-profit is we raise philanthropic funds here, even though there might be an opportunity to do it internationally. That NGO doesn't have the funds to take the innovation and it becomes easier for them to fund it locally and therefore replicate that innovation. That just simply slows things down. It means you can't shift IP between countries. My very practical idea is have a fund that actually funds the shifting of IP between non-profits so that you could take an innovation that may be brilliant in Sweden, got to scale, and bring it to Australia in partnership with a local NGO who can then customise it, who then can add value and shift it to New Zealand, shift it elsewhere. We can't do what private sector does through moving capital to achieve that. So private sector does that through profit. We don't have access to that profit, so we need some other external intervention to shift IP in a way that is currently very difficult. Wouldn't require a lot of money. It means that you'd have to fund things like business planning. It would mean you have to fund things like innovation exchanges and a whole bunch of other things. So not service delivery, but actually the shifting of intellectual property between countries. The second thing is you need to support private investment. My absolute view is there's billions and billions of dollars of new capital sitting on the sidelines that wants to get into this space, and it will either go around us, it will go through us. We have relationships with companies like Google and Macquarie Bank and others that most people would sort of see as the big evil bad guys. They want to support and go through us. They think we've got great expertise, but the capital mechanisms to go through us aren't there. So if there were ways in which we could draw on that private capital to drive innovation and tap into it in a way that charities can't at the moment, then it would be good. There are some mechanisms that are starting to emerge through social impact bonds, but that area needs to be accelerated. My deep concern is if they don't go through us, they will go around us, right? And money will move to where the profit is, and then they will feel bad afterwards and give us 0.5% and guilt money, call it a donation, right? So this is an opportunity where we can drive investment through the capability exists with organisations that are there because of social good. Fundamentally, they're not there to drive profit through a particular individual or group of individuals. They're there to try and genuinely get better, but need the capital to do so. The only way this works is if you have large amounts of capital flowing through quickly, because that's technology. Technology is not an even capital flow. It's about large capital upfront, amortised over a large population. So it's very different than recurrent government funding that our sector's used to. And then the final thing, and I'm trying to do a big handball here to Ian, who will talk about data and movement and others, is we need to coordinate back-end infrastructure. So at the moment, government tends to get in the way of some of this back-end infrastructure, shifting data around and elsewhere. That means that we really need to look at what is it that we can do that can make it as easy as possible for organisations to do what they do best, which is serve their communities of interest, work in partnership with the people that they're serving, while asking for some commonalities of infrastructure that mean we don't need to replicate that again and again. We don't have access again to the capital that a Macquarie Group does to replicate some of these billions of dollars in back-end infrastructure that makes this work. So the only way in which we can do it is, say, have some common back-end infrastructure that allows front-end services to tap into that and then innovate in their service delivery in partnership with the communities that they serve. Most of this is in place now. None of this is radical, but absolutely I would challenge you to think about how your organisation, how your mental health system would look differently in 3 years, because that's the question that technology companies have. The driving question, I've spoken to a senior person, I'll finish here in terms of Google. The driving question of Google is somewhere in the world there are two guys sitting in their garage thinking up the Google killer because they killed Yahoo. And it took them roughly 3 years. So when they talk about transformative change, they're not thinking, will we exist in 10, 15, 20, 50 years? They're thinking, will we exist in 3 years? Right? That drives a huge level of change and innovation that means they're able to achieve things that we think, like zero suicide, are impossible or should take 20 years. They're thinking, actually, we can organise the world's information in the next 3 years, why not? We can put someone on the moon or Mars, why not? We can have a self-driving car, why not? So what we ask, and again I come back to Faye's question, we have all the tools, we have all the knowledge that sits in our system. What we don't have is capital, and my argument is what we don't have is the ambition to do things in 18 months, 3 years and 5 years rather than 5, 20, 15, 30 years, which means from my point of view, another generation will be lost to suicide. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jono. Stay there just for a moment. We're going to have the two presentations in succession and then we'll throw it open to the floor for questions as we've been doing. But just give us some examples, give us some tangibles about the sorts of products, offerings, access points, websites, whatever it is that you're talking about that could be enabled through the right capital. So maybe use ReachOut as an example, sure, or pie in the sky sure, projects that you've seen the kernel of.
So if I look at ReachOut, for example, we're entering into a partnership with a great NGO in LA to operate ReachOut. They're a traditional mental health organisation serving families and children, roughly serving about 3,000. Their CEO took to their board the challenge that said, she asked this question, how many of you took Uber to get to the board meeting? And about 70% put their hand up. And she said, can I be very clear, we're the taxi industry and that guy's Uber. The challenge that we've got at the moment is there are no funds that we can access to do the business planning, the operations that would mean that she can pick up ReachOut, transfer our IP into her local setting and then customise it so that it's relevant for the Californian community.
So
and
you
then take
mean
it
literally
to scale.
take the concept, the model of the website ReachOut.com, which teenagers around Australia and the world access,
Yep.
and kids and early 20-somethings and their parents access, and transplant it onto different platforms
Yep.
and into different
So
contexts.
what we would offer in terms of an intellectual property sense is say we would continue to own the URL. We geolocate the URL. So if you're in US, you would get our logo and branding, which means they don't have to worry about some of those things. They can have our theory of change. They can have all our existing content. So we would essentially, what would otherwise take a multi-year process and you would do test and learn, you could literally take our capability, put it on top of their organisation, and roughly, we did this in Ireland, roughly take about 9 months to build an Irish version of it with Irish people. And then they adapt and innovate from there. But the big part for us and what prevents us from doing this to be reality is that's all overhead for us. And so we've got to say to an Australian donor, can you use support for Australia to help Americans? They go, why wouldn't America do that? And all these sorts of things. So a very practical example is there's innovation, and this is just our example, there's innovation sitting in all our countries that is subscale or operating very well in your country that you could actually accelerate. You essentially pay marginal cost in the new country, and then adapt and innovate and then share again. And if I look at what Google does, that's how they move IP around the world.
So just now tell me, before we come to Ian, what does this mean for someone who is running a community mental health service,
Yep.
or a whole set of different community mental health services? They've got crazy demands on them. They are just scrambling to keep up with the need in their community. What does it mean for them, this conversation?
Absolutely.
And also, what does it mean for the person that they're supporting who might have taken a few years to come into that service because they couldn't quite work out what they needed, but in that time they've been very depressed at home, just, trying to keep on track. It's been tough. What does it mean for them?
Well, I think the first part of it is there is far more demand than supply. So no one will go out of a job if you're doing a great job meeting someone's needs. The challenge is, and the opportunity I think for them is to say, rather than build a business around limited supply, we only have so many hours and so many counsellors, we can only help so many people, is to think differently and say, how would we massively scale our supply? By bringing in self-help tools that can mean they can manage themselves out of hours, by meaning we can access support from other places in the world. It means you have to think through changing your business model in terms of how we get funding, what do we actually mean. And I think the other part that we see is that you will start getting better data back from your users as to whether they like what you're providing. So I think some of the transformations that are coming through NDIS, for example, are the economic changes that should drive the behaviour of the services.
So in Australia, as you know from Tom's presentation and Eddie, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, you probably have your equivalents.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think the biggest change that I would see is a cultural change in our system, which is rather than assuming what I would call a poverty mentality, we don't have enough money, that's going to take 20 years to change, actually start with an abundance mentality. What happens if we have all the money in the world and our only problem is time? That's how technology companies think, right? It's not actually we'll get there in 20 years because they think they'll be bankrupt. It's how do we get there in 3 and chase it? And then I think the challenge for government is about how would they create better capital flows that would match the private sector capital flows so that we could access literally 10, 50, $100 million to scale up quickly. They will want a return on that capital, which I don't think is a bad thing.
But at the heart of this for you is reaching as many people and meeting their needs in the best way possible.
Absolutely.
As you can.
Absolutely. And I think that, if you look in Australia, I always say this about ReachOut, the choice isn't between ReachOut and a psychologist or a doctor, the choice is between getting no help at all and some help, right? I think that is fundamentally for me what drives it. It's not only that there's a choice element, people like certain things, some like talking to someone, some people like organising things themselves, there's absolutely a choice. But at the moment, because our system is built around limited supply that keeps us all in jobs but means we don't help very many people, you actually flip it around and say, what would happen if everybody in Australia or everyone in each one of our countries got the right help within 3 minutes of identifying a need?
Wow.
Rather than 6 weeks or 8 weeks waiting list, what would happen if literally I can turn around tomorrow and say, I want that type of help and it's available, it's cost effective, And we'll only get there when we fundamentally change the model of demand and supply.
So I bet you've got lots of questions and comments and uncertainties about all that. So hold on to them, please. John O'Nicholas, thank you. He'll join us again. So I wanted to ask a few extra questions just to get a sense of what shape it all takes in our lives, you know. So our next speaker, speaking to the technology challenge, what leaders need to know about real-time data and online mental health supports, is psychiatrist Professor Ian Hickie. He is co-director of Health and Policy of the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney. And amongst other roles, he's the National Mental Health Commissioner, or a National Mental Health Commissioner with the National Mental Health Commission here in Australia. He's very well known here as a long-time, very effective mental health campaigner in the public eye with successive governments. He's got lots of red jelly beans in his pocket. He's constantly very energetic advocate for his profession, for the people he supports. And he was the inaugural CEO of Beyond Blue, which is a national depression initiative here in Australia, and he served as their clinical advisor too. A very effective public campaign, in effect, to raise awareness about depression. Anyway, he's champing at the bit to get on the stage. Please welcome Ian Hickie.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I would like to start by recognising the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I do think, personally, I live in Sydney, I come and go, I just love coming back here, even if the weather is changing as we go. I just wonder, during the previous presentation, how many people were playing with their phone, tweeting, whatever else, and probably won't be listening to a word I say as I go on, because they're busy interacting with the world outside. How transformative is that from the meetings that we've had over the previous years? Who thinks Uber is a good idea? Who thinks the Uberisation of your own industry is a good idea? Some not so sure about that on an ongoing basis. As Jono said, not an Uberisation, who actually thinks disruption of your industry, something you are not in control of, is a good idea? Jackie. You'll see on my slide here, on my title slide, it is about Jackie. I am thrown out about, Jackie is somebody with lived experience, personally, carer. Sorry? She's over there, okay. Damien, others. You know, for me, the issue about data and the particular thing, now, what the issue about data is every time you do something, you've done something, you've created data, you have interacted in real time. Jono's talking, I'm trying to work out his real side from other sites. I'm commenting on what he is saying in real time back to our other world, hopefully including our current health minister, about what he is saying is the current situation in real time. Not 5 years later to tell me what the suicide rate was in Queensland, 5 years after we miscalculated and didn't correct the data, and then we responded 5 years after the problem. In real time. We are doing it in real time in just about everything else we do currently. And the real-time data, the point of it is actually, as Jono was ending there with, it is access and quality. I can't stand to go to another conference and have to have Faye and other people, Jackie, talk about their current experiences, or the experience that I have from time to time, sitting with parents whose kids have killed themselves by suicide in various ways, who've died, and they say as individuals, what more could I have done? Which is really not the question, is what more could have we done? To which, in my head, is thinking stacks. We could have done stacks of things. We could be doing things today all around the country with utilisation of expertise and technology as it is. But we'll sit here kind of contemplating whether it is or not the right time for the right actions. Jono's been doing it with ReachOut for 20 years. It's been out there in the non-government world for 20 years through Jack Heath's marvellous insight about, his relative dying in rural Australia as a young man disconnected, that the technology to connect was already there. As Jackie was just pointing out in the session we were in, it's not about us, meaning I'm a clinician. You'll see missing from the middle of this, there's the users and there's those who run systems. Clinicians are entirely absent from my slide. Sorry, I'm one of them. It's no longer about us, the providers. There is an issue at the government level, which is profound, and I hope Alan Fels is around somewhere, and if you don't have the chance to talk economics with Alan Fels, you should. Alan's a marvellous economist. He doesn't really care. Disrupt a taxi industry? Alan's up for it. Disrupt another industry? It's up for it. It's about competition. It's about change. It's not about planning the economy. You don't plan economies. You regulate, you create parameters, and you look at the outcome. and you see what's happening to the outcome. You don't try and control what is entirely outside your control. So I reckon, despite the Trump phenomenon that we're in, and the post-Trump era, I just heard the phenomenon of post-Obama trauma being discussed by American colleagues in another room. I am actually, surprisingly, optimistic. I love disruption. I love the idea that we finally got to a point where I may not have to hear the same stories or sit on the same human rights inquiries or the same Senate inquiries or the same government inquiries anymore. In fact, Jackie and I discuss regularly, our role as national commissioners might be up, finished. We don't need to report back anymore that it doesn't work because the point of disruption exists for all the reasons that Jono just highlighted, as they have in other industries. And most of us welcome disruption. We mightn't like Uber per se, but geez, we like what it's done to the taxi industry. We like the way it's changed the whole set of assumptions. We might not like Airbnb per se. We might choose to stay in very expensive hotels, but we like what it's done. We like the way in which the fundamental assumptions and what was not being done suddenly got done in our lifetimes, and we didn't know that it was going to happen. What surprises me all the time is the extent to which people in healthcare don't realise the basic issues that Jono was highlighting. Everyone wants healthcare. I once spent time with the Chinese Minister for Health who said, you just imagine, in China, in one generation, they went from a life expectancy of under 30 to a life expectancy over 70. When people live under 30, you don't have to plan education, schools, healthcare, because not many people get to use them. When suddenly they get to live over 70, guess what? What they want is education and healthcare. You know, these are the big drivers of social equity and of change worldwide. Big money, big markets. The question is, are we going to play a role in that? And what is the role? And what is the role of government? What is the role of expertise? And how do we respond to these sets of challenges? Because it is, in the end, about wealth. And as our Prime Minister now says, it's wealth. It's either wealth that we can have in a productive way and add to our productivity and be at the front end of it, or is actually wealth that is lost through a failure to capitalise on those sets of issues. And you know, that is what it's about. It's really good at the moment to have a Prime Minister, for however long we have a Prime Minister in Australia, which is often not long, who actually says it's not just a healthcare delivery business, it's a social productivity issue. And the cognitive resources of our citizens is our major resource in the 21st century. When we talk about outcomes, because I want to use data to drive outcomes in real time, you've got to be clear about what the outcomes actually are. And the main ones are productivity. They're not reduction in symptom scores. They're not things that clinicians muck around for, a little K10 here, a little depression score there, a little bit of anxiety, a little less substance use. It's the productivity of our lives, or in our National Commission, what we talk about as a contributing life. It's all about the big ones. Can we assist people to live more productive lives? And the disruptions that Jono talked about are fundamentally disruptions of other industries that haven't understood that they're a barrier to productivity. And someone comes along, you know what? You are a barrier. You're not a supporter of productivity. And that's the big issue we've got to look at, as well as the other multidimensional outcomes that I'm highlighting in that particular slide. At the same time, the nature of these things is not just to be more productive. We want things to be more personalised. You know, one level, the one thing I like about the clinical aspects of mental health, which is quite different to other areas of medicine, it has, and as someone pointed from somebody with $1 billion to invest pointed out to me, you have one thing that other areas of healthcare don't have. You've always been more interested in the person. You somehow lost it when you had that DSM diagnostic stuff come along and all other stuff. You lost what you was fundamentally good at. How do you get back to putting the person actually at the centre of the whole thing? So we want that personalised bit to be there, but while we personalise, we also got to go to scale. If we're going to be relevant, Google says if it doesn't affect 1 billion people, we're not investing in it. If it can't go to 1 billion people, forget it. You know, it's not something that's just one clinician interacting with one person. It's got to be able to be scaled in all these areas. You go talk to mental wealth stuff, it's about disability costs, it's about young people, it's about old people. They're the things that we need to invest in. They are the groups who actually are outside most of the systems at the moment, who will be most brought into the systems through appropriate technology. Those who are most out, cost the most, have the most to gain. As Jackie points out regularly, I'll point over there, Jackie, they're already doing it. They already realise the systems we built from the 19th and 20th century, leave them out, those great hospitals. Every time we have another flood of government money into mental health, what do? Build more hospitals. We love them. It must be good. It was good for cancer. It was good for heart disease. Give us another hospital. Run around the city, you'll see new hospitals, new money in mental health, new hospitals. In fact, my colleague Sebastian Rosenberg just published something online just in the last 24 hours. What have we done with more money in mental health? We've built more hospitals. What we're really good at. It kind of makes us serious in mental health care. It doesn't get young people, youth and ageing populations the care they need in their own environments, under their own care. So as Jackie points out constantly, if you don't do it, we're going to pay for it ourselves. You know, whether you pay for it or not, wasting my public money, but it doesn't respond to my sets of characteristics. So, are we really up for the Uberisation of this, you know, in a particular kind of way? What are its real characteristics that we're really interested in? You know, and they are really fundamental ones. You know, they are about access, the demand-driven sets of characteristics. It's out there. You know, and the key element, there are many elements of Uber, but I don't know about you, you know, one of them is you can just do what you like. You know, you don't have to talk to some stupid 1300 number for a taxi that never comes. If you've ever been in Canberra, they never come. You know, in a particular way. It's there when you want it under your control, and the device is already there. It's not about when it will arrive. It's already in some places in the world, especially in California, and this is in Palo Alto, there are no more taxis. I asked, could I get a taxi? Someone laughed at me. They're dead. They're gone. You know, because there's a much better system, and it's already, your access point is already in your pocket. It's already there on an ongoing basis. It's empowering. You know, if you've been mucked around by something, and you don't have to talk to those people who muck you around anymore, it's very, very desirable, you know, in a particular way. And we are all doing that all the time, in transport, in restaurants, in hotels, and everywhere else, and we want to do it in healthcare. And we want to have that particular kind of set of characteristics. The availability of service, it's there. You know, it's got to be there, and it's got to be there to actually meet demand. So if it's going to work, if Uber's going to work, it has to turn up. You know, if Uber doesn't turn up, like the taxi doesn't turn up, you're not going to do it. And you can track it, and you can see how it's responding. If it's 5 minutes away or 3 minutes away, it's around the corner, it's missed you, whatever else. It's constantly providing information back to you about your thing. And of course, once you get to do it, you get to say about them. And if they're no good, and that particular individual is no good for very long, they're out of the system. Could you imagine in our system if providers were not very good for very long on a few things, out of the system? I'm sure we'd have problems with that. You know, but fundamentally, the users of the system are driving the quality of the system in real time. Now, I make this sort of what's said to be a joke, but I don't mean it's a joke at all. I don't know why we aren't doing that with every user of every system of our systems every day. I don't know why we aren't lining up in every service system and saying, please, 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 rate us. Please, please, do it. In fact, for about 25 years, I've been trying to do this in mental health care with paper and pencil tests and all sorts of other things. And the first thing is usually for those who provide the service, we can't do that. You know, that's just a really bad idea. You know, they'll complain. I used to have a thing where I used to encourage the people that I used to look after directly in the service I was in to please complain. Please write. Don't say I'm a nice person, because, you know, some days I am, sometimes I'm not. Don't say that. Just say my service is suboptimal, because my service is suboptimal. The service I provide is suboptimal. That most of the service systems, if not all the service systems that I've worked in my life, are suboptimal from a user perspective. They have all sorts of characteristics we know fall down. Please complain. People think it's a bad thing. No, it isn't. It's a driver to change, not just at the individual person level. I'm not responsible for the whole mental health system as it operates, or the hospital I work in, or whatever. But actually, unless you tell back as the user of that system, actually we're very slow to change, if at all, over time. We have all sorts of reasons why we couldn't do it. So quality's driven in particular issue, you know, and the quality issue and the survivability, whether Uber's better or not, whether Uber is better than taxis depends on it actually being better. You know, the moment it's not, as Jono points out, I love it. The moment somebody else comes along, it's dead. Uber has competitors. It moves on in particular ways. That's really profound. The accountability issue is really important. The more and more data you have coming in, there's accountability at the local level, but what I want is accountability at the system level. The more that you can see, there's a project that Jane and I are working on with the National Government, Project Synergy, is all about combining the back ends to see where people really go. So people like ReachOut have already participated with us in various trials. You can put one platform on top of another, and you can see where people really go. You can see what they're doing. Do they like ReachOut Next Step? Do they not like ReachOut Next Step? Would they prefer to use another particular set of apps? As Jackie prefers and tells everybody, she prefers the sleep app from the UK rather than my one, because the one from the UK is better. And although it costs money and mine's free, it's still better. And she would prefer to buy a better system than not a better system. And if, you know, next year, after 20 years, ReachOut's not the best system in the world, and there's a better one developed in Ireland or a better one developed in Canada, it'll be gone. And it'll be replaced. And that's the great driver in this thing. We're no longer constrained by the boundaries. We're no longer stuck with who treats PTSD in Perth, or what is the treatment of eating disorders in Nowra on the south coast, or what is happening in the Gippsland. You can get from around the world the best development in those areas. Now, mental health, unlike others of healthcare, unlike surgery and other things, a lot of what needs to be done can be done by facilitating with the person themselves, with the family, with expertise, and the expertise that you can bring. Small number of professionals interacting with that, you can take expertise long distances in particular ways. So you've got a big opportunity to share expertise over long distances and across populations. Big chances. The economics of this is the fundamental. So if Fells was in the room, you get economics 101 here. Stop planning the economy, stop the Great Leap Forward, stop the Soviet planning, which you're also good at, stop the 5th National Mental Health Plan in Australia, forget it. Just get out and actually focus on the users, and then what's the regulations and systems you need to sit around that in real time. If there's no real-time feedback, there's the missing loop. So the commission that we've sat on since 2012 had as its primary brief from the Prime Minister at the time, Julia Gillard, very forward-thinking. If we knew, at least on an annual basis, what was going on, we could make better choices. Imagine if we knew on a daily basis what was going on. Imagine in suicidality, if we knew in suicide attempts in each of our communities every week what was going on, we'd make real-time decisions back. My central argument is it can. It's already in your pocket. We just choose not to use it. We actually choose not to have it in our systems. We are choosing not to. Very dangerous when other people with $1 billion to invest want to. The National Commission said, 2014, just for God's sake, get out there and do it as an essential plank of any serious mental health reform in this country. And Jane Burns has led the kind of assessments here in what has become the Project Synergy thing. The government's role is back-end infrastructure. Jono's third bit on the end, the back-end infrastructure. Forget the retail brands. Government doesn't need to compete with ReachOut or Beyond Blue or Headspace or anyone else, Lifeline in this country. It needs to put the back-end joining infrastructure so data moves around and can move then internationally. As the Productivity Commission's made clear in Australia, it's the regulatory environment that will kill or support these industries, not the healthcare environment on an ongoing basis. And the regulatory one is both legal, both privacy, but also how systems actually move. So at the heart of this has been Australia actually has had a considerable advantage over other countries through the CRC work led by Jane and others, started out in ReachOut, partnership out of the non-government organisations. We just did a meeting downstairs, and don't tell anyone this, with the academics are just about ready to join in. Just getting ready, okay? It already happened. ReachOut already did it 20 years ago. ReachOut already partnered with research back into got this CRC, got things going. The technology's been worked out in young people, combinations of health promotion, clinics, feedback into those systems, working with non-government organisations, being brand blind, being retail blind. ReachOut can work with this, they can work with others. We don't care. Why should you care? You just want to get the best you can get on an ongoing basis. You can produce dashboards of need. My essential and sort of closing kind of comment about this really is if the user puts the need in first, they get the system they want. Our systems ask the user, what do you want? What do you need? It's in suicidality, it's in work, it's in home, it's in physical health. What's the needs? Because then you're going to map the care onto the needs. Not what do I do? I'm a hospital, I put people in beds. I'm a psychology clinic, I give you 6 or 10 sessions because one's magical compared with the other. I'm a psychiatrist, I prescribe. That's not actually the answer if you're from the user point of view. In the Uber sense, you say where you are, where you want to go, and that's what you need, and I want the best and most affordable and most accessible way of getting there. And when I get there, if it's no good, I'm going to tell the people running this system, it's no good, you're a rotten driver, you're no good. Or mostly, interestingly, it's very good. People really like it. It's better than they thought. So the earlier example, there are very few people that move through our mental health care system in an episode of care who say at the end it's very good. And that is the sad reality on an ongoing basis. So just to say these systems are there, they exist in Australia, we're going to roll them out. And I just would finally to say, I'm not talking, I said downstairs, and somebody misinterpreted me, I'm not saying clinicians have no role, but the shared decision-making role we're working on is the clinician is supporting the user in the best possible way, not the other way around. Thanks.
Right. I'm going to throw it straight to you guys for discussion. Now, we've got some slides with some questions on them. And, I'm actually curious to know, who has a smartphone with a wellbeing type app on it? Keep your hand up, or put your hand down if you don't use it. So, did I do that right? It was, wasn't it?
Obviously lost us.
Who's got a wellbeing app on their phone? Keep your hand up if you use it. Yeah. I think that's interesting, you know. Some of this stuff's a bit fad-like, isn't it? What we're going to do now is spend 10 minutes at your tables considering these 6 questions, 3 from Ian and 3 from Jono. 10 minutes just to give yourself a big powwow afternoon session. Consider those questions and then we'll open it out to the room for the rest of the session. Thank you. Let's open it out to the floor. We've got our speakers, Ian Hickie and Jono Nicholas. I'm very interested to see what came up for you in response to these questions. Sometimes this stuff it feels more ephemeral, doesn't it? We don't always know what we don't know until we've played in the space. So, yes, over to you. Thank you. So, a response to any of these questions that have come from your table, or otherwise.
Hello, I'm sorry to dominate again. Point number 1, I think I would like to respond to. So I currently look after a counselling workforce of about 63. We cover the whole country in New Zealand. There are not enough people to go around for the people who need the help, and it's costly and it's expensive. I used to run our quit line, and we looked after 40,000 people a year with a 35% quit success rate, blah, blah, blah. And we had about 30 people did that. And I'm challenging my workforce to say, think about e-tools in your care to reach all the points you made. Oh, no, we can't do that because, you know, our people need to see us and da-da-da-da, and I hear all this all the time. Well, the example I use, and I'll share with you, is that I used to listen into calls just to check and do mystery shop when I was running the quit line. And I sat and listened to a call one day, and a chap rang up from Taumarunui, if anyone knows the area from New Zealand. He was a contractor who lost his job. He would have been about 45. His wife was threatening to leave him. He had to do something to get control of the fact that he was bleeding money, so he thought he'd try and quit smoking one more time. He's spilling his guts on the phone. It's a hard thing to do, pouring out his life story to somebody he doesn't know. This chap is a redneck from way back, I could tell by the voice. The person he's talking to is a 25-year-old Samoan boy from Auckland. He wouldn't cross the street to talk to Senior, but he's spilling his heart and soul out. Senior's helping him get his quit plan together. When the conversation finishes, only 10.5 minutes, by the way, it ends with, oh, mate, thanks a lot, you've been a trooper. Down goes the phone. So, point 1, yes, absolutely, and sometimes the face is the problem, and e-tools get us around that. So, kia ora.
Ah, what a great story. Thank you so much. Any other comments, reflections, a response? But let's come to the floor. Have we got another one there? Faye. Get out of the way.
I think that what is one opportunity to maximise the benefits of technology, and that's funding really good peer workers to build some apps that peer workers have available for people to access services as well. At the moment, most of the apps, and I'm sure they're happening with some input from people with lived experience, but I would like to see what apps would be if a good amount of money were put into peer workers having apps, building apps that could be used in this way as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I sat in on the peer workers match group, and there was talk of a movement, a momentum to build a national association for peer workers. And then there was another layer on, well, there's an international association, although it's a bit American in bent apparently. So could you imagine tools like this actually building a community of peer workers, enabling connection across, so you don't all have to meet in Sydney in person necessarily? For services, yes.
Just on that, Faye, a lot of the apps in particular, like Kick It and Hello Sunday Morning, they connect people to social movements. Including people. So I think one thing that's misunderstood about apps, and I think even Natasha's question, but do you still play with your own app? That's not the question. Nobody does. But if you join a social group that does exercise that uses Fitbits, if you join Kick It to quit smoking and you have a social group, then you have a big effect. So one of the things that technologies do, which is why Facebook, everything works, is not because of the technology, it's social participation. So one of the things that, despite all the things that are said about us being more disconnected by technology, in fact, many groups are actually more connected. And if you want behaviour change, so peer workers, other people sharing the same problem in one way or another, they are some of the big workforce issues that are directly addressed by technology.
Yeah.
Yes, but it needs to not just be social, you know, like that's very important and absolutely wonderful. And I love that there's been lived experience input into a lot of the apps and people are listening. But I would like for there to be a peer work app where people are delivering peer support, and then for that to be, to follow, for that to be followed in the research and see how that comes out, and as well, that would be really good.
If anyone wants to talk to Faye further about that, maybe a movement could be built in this room after this meeting to continue that conversation. Get Jono's startup movement behind it. Another comment. Where are we next? Yes, at the front here. Thank you. Just we'll wait until the mic gets to you. Or is there someone there? There?
Hi, Isabella Goldie from Mental Health Foundation UK. I think I just want to say a couple of things about some of the barriers and where the greatest resistance lies, and obviously the very obvious ones around, the safety issues and issues around privacy and how we ensure the quality of apps, etc. And I think that makes people very nervous. But I think only part of what lies behind it, but I think it's quite an issue, is that a lot of people making the decisions about this stuff are not digital natives. They didn't grow up with digital technology. It's a communication tool at best for them, whereas young people, we know it's not a communication tool, it's a world, it's another plane of a world, it's something that's another reality or part of their reality and embedded in a way that, once you get, 40 plus, you're much less likely to view it that way. So some of the decisions that are being made, I think, are being made by people who are nervous personally about technology, and I think that will play out in some of the funding decisions that are made.
I think that's a great point, because it's the one that I hear all the time, which is we've got to protect quality. Interestingly, we don't seem to have those same concerns when new pharmaceuticals come onto the... And so I think, for me, it's sort of one of these things where it's used in this context to say, we can't do it until we're 100% sure that a self-help app is going to be good. And yet we continue to operate in a system where we're doing a whole range of interventions where the evidence would at best be questionable, or it's good for some people but has wide usage. So I think I absolutely agree with you. I think one of the things, again, another practical idea that comes out of this is create a decision point, say in 1 to 3 years, where you have self-help apps be rebated through Medicare or other NHS-style systems, right? That will then say you've then got an economic stream coming off this, right? It will literally change the economic models overnight, because you'll get private investment as you would in a whole range of things. And then say, just as we do in pharmaceuticals or other things, government has to drive quality control. Right? It means you have to drive research, you have to drive innovation. The great advantage, and for those that are interested, we did some economic policy work on this with EY in 2 studies, one called Crossroads, that looks at this at a system point of view. Because of your entry point on self-help tools is relatively low in terms of your research investment point, you can actually build up the evidence for roughly a few $100,000, get it to scale and build that system, which means you can get it out. Interesting, I don't know too many apps where someone's proven that it's harmful. I can't think of an example where someone said Fitbit's harmful to someone's health, for example, or so that's the kind of the flip of it, is what would we do to hold these tools to the same level of evidence and quality control that we do the existing system of intervention rather than a higher bar.
Yeah, and I want to know that I was told all my life never get into a car with a stranger, and now I'm being told by everyone to get into a car with a stranger. I want to know it's regulated.
Can I go one step further? How do you feel about driverless cars? I mean, talk about risk. Jesus, they're going to crash, they're going to kill people. How many people die on the roads every year? I had the experience in the United States last month, twice, to sit in the front seat of a driverless car going down the streets of Washington and the streets of Vancouver. I was scared witless, right? The notion that the car doesn't have a driver. You know, things we take for age, we get to a certain age, you get to a certain stage, a certain fix, and you think, like I think, oh, driverless cars, yeah, I've seen them down the track. I find myself last month sitting in Washington and in Vancouver in driverless cars, going at speed down the thing, and actually being safer. The thing looks around all the time. It's doing things humans doesn't do. So this issue of risk and how we perceive risk and how, if you're a certain age, you wear a suit, probably male, and you regulate what you think is risky versus actual risk, big issue for us to sort through. At the moment, risk is bid in this area completely disproportionate. Do you use internet banking?
Yeah.
Like, you know, I mean, do we trade really private information, valuable information all the time?
And I'm just interested in this conversation. It's very live in my work environment as a journalist and broadcaster. We dichotomise between the digital natives and then the rest of us old fogies, you know, and I think that we need to start thinking really radically different about that conversation. We need to link the life experience and professional experience of the 40 plus, 50 plus, 60, 70, 80, 90-year-olds with the digital native.
Let's be clear, the
skill
70,
base.
80, 90s are going for technology big time.
Oh, I know
now
they
that they've
are.
got more problems.
But in workplaces, I think that's an interesting
it's a workplace
tension.
issue.
And people feel like their professional experience and nuance isn't valued, and an app will save it. So how do we actually link those multiple generations? Quick comments from 2 people, and then we're going to wrap. Oh, well, no, we'll try a few more. If we can, I'll go through a few of you.
I'm very interested. We used simple examples like a taxi trip. But you know, when we pay a general practitioner, we pay them on whether it's 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever. We've got very naive assumptions of what constitutes a good outcome right across the whole of our health activity. And I'm wondering I'm interested in the idea of how we build in better assessments about whether the money was spent well, one of which will be personal satisfaction. But one might be, do I get back to work within, you know, a week, a month, 3 months, never? You know, how do we get decent assessments about whether the money has been well spent, not simply am I satisfied with it?
Yeah,
Can you hang on to that?
Yes, sir.
Can I just grab another one? I'm just going to grab 4 comments quickly. So, yes, thank you. Quick one.
So, at the Mental Health Association of San Francisco, we live at the heart of Silicon Valley. And there are about 70 apps being developed every month, specifically related to mental health. And it's a very interesting Wild West out there. So I go to meetups, 200 developers, just focusing on how do you develop apps to help in this space. So it's very interesting in a lot of ways, because what people have recognized is that with regard to health, there's relatively little that you can do to interface with physical health, but the neurocognitive, the CBT-based stuff, other things have a potential to really impact people's health. But I'm partly bringing it up in response to the prior question which came up, which is we've looked at, through the Mental Health Technology Institute, what were apps, what were services that consumers, that people living with mental health conditions would really actively use, that they would feel were helpful. And so I think that initiative is ready for a study. I'd like to see people really starting to look at, from the user perspective, what is really helpful. And there is a project out of University of South Carolina that has a registry of many apps, and evaluates them in terms of certain types of performance. But the other thing that I think is really interesting, and we haven't really talked about here, is the use of kind of neurocognitive interventions through technology. There's been some very exciting stuff where people have, with certain types of panic disorders, other types of issues, there are apps that actually help people manage in an active real-time way stress, distress, and other things. So I think that it's an exciting Wild West, but we shouldn't think about the opportunities as constrained to, kind of, in a certain sense, a new interface for old style services, but really think about how can personal devices change and enhance your wellness in a more sophisticated way.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. There were two over here which I'd just like to capture. Thanks.
This is slightly more tangential, but we've used a free online self-assessment tool for.
And where are you from? Sorry.
From New Zealand, for capability building or capacity building for the NGO sector, because everybody says that NGO sectors don't do this and don't do that. So what we've done is we've developed an online self-assessment tool. Initially thinking this will be great for the mental health sector, but actually it doesn't matter who it's for, so it's now free, available, and that came about from just trying to solve a problem and then thinking, goodness me, we can't do that manually, it has to be online. And over sort of 500 people are now using that with no publicity whatsoever. The other way that we've been using that and maximising the online space is through the Equally Well initiative in New Zealand, which is about physical health and mental health, but using existing online platforms. So we've been using Lumio, which is an online decision-making tool, and that brings together a whole bunch of people to have a different sort of conversation, and they're having that conversation not through their professional lens or their consumer lens, but because they do care about the issues of physical health. So what it's done is it started off to solve that problem, but it's become this huge discourse and a huge conversation that's making changes in New Zealand.
Well, that sounds fantastic. I want to know more about that. One more there, thanks.
Good afternoon. So I guess I want to come back to the Uberization issue for just a second, and maybe the driverless car as well. I'm from Pittsburgh, where we see them all the time now. And that is that Uberization actually is a technology that facilitates the use of a tangible resource that people use all the time, i.e. they need to drive from one place to the other, and there were cars lying around that weren't being used, and now this technology allows us to use it. But ultimately, the product is you go from one place to another. It's not the technology itself. The same with this self-driving car. The importance of that is that you now have a car that doesn't require a driver who is going to have to spend their time driving that car. That car can be utilized around the clock and doesn't have to have anybody mending or tending to it all the time. So there's something specifically delivered. My concern about the discussion so far is that it's not entirely clear what it is. What is the asset that's being freed up? What is the service that's being delivered through these technological platforms? There's a tendency, I think, to think that the technology is the solution. The technology is not the solution. The technology is a means to a utility of a resource that we are not well using at the current time. So I'm wondering how you guys are imagining that. What are the categories of utilization of new resources, of things that we can take advantage of that we couldn't take advantage of before we had this technology?
Great, and let's loop that around to the... What was that? Yeah, and let's loop it around to the first comment, which was how do you actually, better assess using these tools as well? What are you assessing for? What are you measuring? Go.
So I think the first part in answer to that question would be we currently have very, very expensive talent being utilised and spending a huge amount of time doing things that it doesn't need to do, right? So you've got Ian, who's got years and years and years of academic training, and others doing stuff that you could actually largely do through repetitive that frees up a resource that's uniquely valuable. So that's one part. The second part is, if you look at the Uberization and go back to Faye's comment, is we actually have a large workforce sitting on the bench that can't be accessed, right, in terms of peer workforce, self-help tools. So there is actually a similar sort of resource. I guess I would kind of come back to a more central point, right, which is that if you are sitting in a technology conference, you're not thinking about how to solve things in 20 years using abstract data, to Ian's point. You're thinking about how do we solve things in the next 18 months to 3 years. That changes the fundamental mentality of just how much money you put into things working their way through. So Uber wasn't just a single idea, one-off big bet. It emerged because there's a huge amount of capital flowing into this space to solve a whole range of problems. My central frustration is that we don't have what I would call the abundance mentality that says, what happens if we change the paradigm? Rather, my 3 boys are, oldest is 8, the leading cause of death, the number one reason why I lose my boys if they were young men now is suicide. What I would say if actually in the next 5 years, suicide doesn't exist for my boys, right? That's why I love the driverless car, because I think they will be stupid teenagers and I don't want them to drive. So you change the whole mentality that means that you actually start solving these problems through a major flow of capital. My big concern, I guess my one final warning to everybody is it can either go through us or around us. And I would actually see, I think there's a huge amount of compassion, capacity, capability that sits in our sector, and I'm not convinced that the geniuses of the world that only sit in Silicon Valley are going to solve this problem. I think they will solve it through a particular lens that may be valuable, but you will miss the huge amount of capability that will go around the world unless we find ways to open up capital beyond Silicon Valley, where a lot of this capital is now compressed, to solve complex problems like healthcare in a culturally sensitive way, because it is more complex than moving a car.
Okay, and we need to get some of you in the room with the app developers in San Fran, don't we? Ian?
So the commodity is healthcare. Just like Uber's part of the transport. You've got to go from here to there. There are ways of doing it. One's personal transport. It's transport. So healthcare is the commodity. What's in healthcare, how it's done, to go to the second question, the cognitive issues, and then the one, what matters, I hope one of those slides I flicked over said the outcome is participation. That is the outcome. We want to work and have productive lives. We want to be able to participate. One of the biggest predictors of that is neurocognitive ability, not symptoms. The assessment of neurocognitive ability, you just can't guess your neurocognitive ability. You have to assess it. Technology does that much better. You can have reliable personal things about your reaction time, your speed, your cognitive ability. So we actually incorporate not apps, not just developing apps, but cognitive assessment online, tools that come back about your circadian rhythm, your body clock, that you can't just guess. Technology brings that back, and it's personalised, not a general clinician, this and that. And your N equals 1, the experiment in you, which is the personal bit, that does it move you for your healthcare in the direction of productivity. You know, this is really different, and I think we get a bit stuck, like the drivers of the car can't go anywhere unless we got our hands on the wheel. Well, it can, and perhaps safer and perhaps more efficiently, because it monitors the environment in a different way that might actually deliver the outcome, you know, which is productivity, through healthcare, you know, through transport. So we get a little bit stuck, and I think Jono's question is the essential one, around us or through us. You know, I think we have deep insights about a number of these things, but are we engaged with those kind of discussions? So the neurocognitive one I love, the circadian one are two examples I would use. Not build an app for my current CBT for something that's 50 years old. It's actually new assessments online into my life, personalised, onto the productivity outcome.
Around us or through us, but through us providing that it's going to actually be useful and we're not wasting precious time developing
if we're
tools.
we're a barrier, just drive through. You know, like
Interesting.
really,
Yeah, interesting.
really,
Yeah.
if we're in the way, we should step out of the way.
That'll take you into the evening, that conversation, won't it? Look, can you please thank Ian Hickie and Jono Nicholas? Thank you. Thank you. And we've got presents for you.